Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Village Affairs by Miss Reed. Although I had told the vicar that I was not unduly bothered by the rumors, it was not strictly true. Somehow this time, as the merry-go-round twirled, the ostrich had a menacing expression as it appeared among the galloping horses. Perhaps, I told myself, everything seemed worse because I had heard the news from several sources in a very short space of time. After school, I pottered about in the kitchen preparing a salad which Amy, my old college friend, was going to share that evening. She had promised to deliver a pile of garments for a future jumble sale, and as James, her husband, was away from home, we were free to enjoy each other's company. Apart from a deplorable desire to reform my slack ways, Amy is the perfect friend. True, she also attempts to marry me off now and again to some poor unsuspecting male, but this uphill job has proved in vain so far, and I think she knows in her heart that she will never be successful. It was while I was washing lettuce that Mr. Willett arrived with some broadbean plants. "Saw you'd got some terrible gaps in your row, miss. Bit late perhaps to put 'em in, but we'll risk it, shall us?" I agreed wholeheartedly. He departed along the garden path, and I returned to the sink. "No rose in all the world," warbled Mr. Willett, "until you came." Mr. Willett has a large repertoire of songs which were popular at the beginning of the century. They take me back in a flash to the musical evenings beloved of my parents. Mercifully, I can only remember snippets of these sentimental ballads, most of which had a lot of ah-ah-ahing between verses, although a line or two here and there still sticks in my memory. "Dearest, the night is over," or was it lonely? "Waneth the trembling moon," and another about living in a land of roses but dreaming of a land of snow, or maybe the other way around. It was the sort of question to put to Mr. Willett, I decided, when Amy arrived and Mr. Willett and the ballads were temporarily forgotten. "Lovely to be here," sighed Amy after we had eaten our meal. She leant back in the armchair and sipped her coffee. "You really do make excellent coffee," she said approvingly, "despite the haphazard way you measure the beans." "Thank you," I said humbly. I rarely get praise from Amy, so that it is all the more flattering when I do. She surveyed one elegant hand with a frown. "My nails grow at such a rate. I always remember a horrifying tale I read when I was about 10. A body was exhumed, and the poor woman's coffin was full of her own hair and immensely long fingernails. Horrible, but it's common knowledge that they go on growing after death." "A solemn thought to imagine all those dark partings on Judgment Day," commented Amy, patting her own neat waves. "Well, what's the Fairacre news?" I told her about the school and its possible closure. "That's old hat. I shouldn't worry unduly about that, though I did hear someone saying they'd heard that Beech Green was to be enlarged." "The grapevine spreads far and wide," I agreed. "But what about Mrs. Fowler?" "Mrs. Fowler?" I repeated with a bewilderment. "You mean that wicked old harridan who used to live in Tyler's Row? Why, she left for Caxley years ago." "I know she did. That's why I hear about her from my window cleaner who lives next door to her, poor fellow. Well, she's being courted." "Never! I don't believe it." Amy looked pleasantly gratified at my reaction. "And what's more, the man is the one that Minnie Pringle married." This was staggering news, and I was suitably impressed. "Minnie Pringle is the niece of my redoubtable Mrs. Pringle. We Fairacre folk have lost count of the children she has had out of wedlock, and were all dumbfounded when we heard that she was marrying a middle-aged man with children of his own. As far as I knew, they had settled down fairly well together at Springbourne, but if Amy's tale were to be believed, then the marriage must be decidedly shaky." "Mrs. Pringle hasn't said anything," I said. "She may not know anything about it." "Besides," I went on, "can you imagine anyone falling for Mrs. Fowler? She's absolutely without charms of any sort." "That's nothing to do with it," replied Amy. "There's such a thing as incomprehensible attraction. Look at some of the truly dreadful girls at Cambridge who managed to snaffle some of the most attractive men." But Mrs. Fowler, I protested. Amy swept on. One of the nastiest men I ever met, she told me, had 4 wives. What, all at once? A Moslem or something? No, no, said Amy testily. Don't be so headlong. You mean headstrong. I know what I mean, thank you. You rush headlong to conclusions, is what I mean. I'm sorry. Well, what was wrong with this nasty man you knew? Well, for one thing, he cleaned out his ears with a matchstick. Not the striking end, I hope. It's terribly poisonous. Whichever end he used, the operation was revolting. Oh, I agree, absolutely. What else? Several things. He was mean with money, kicked the cat, had Wagner, of all people, too loud on the gramophone, and yet, you see, he had this charm, this charisma. Now, there's a word I never say, like Charivari, Punch or the London one, you know. Amy tut-tutted with exasperation. The point I have been trying to make for the last 10 minutes, shouted Amy rudely, against fearful odds, is that Minnie Pringle's husband must see something attractive in Mrs. Fowler. I thought we'd agreed on that, I said. More coffee? Thank you, said Amy faintly. I feel I need it. The fascinating subject of Mrs. Fowler and her admirer did not crop up again until the last day of the spring term. Excitement, as always, was at fever pitch among the children. One would think that they were endlessly beaten and bullied at school when one sees the joy with which they welcomed the holidays. Pat Smith, who had been my infants teacher for the past 2 years, was leaving to get married at Easter, and we presented her with a tray and a large greeting card signed by all the children. The vicar called to wish her well and to exhort the children to help their mothers during the holidays and to enjoy themselves. When he had gone, I contented myself with impressing upon them the date of their return and let them loose. Within minutes, the stampede had vanished round the bend of the lane, and I was alone in the schoolroom. I always love that first moment of solitude, when the sound of the birds is suddenly noticed, and the scent of the flowers reminds one of the quiet country pleasures ahead. Now, freed from the bondage of the clock and the school timetable, there would be time to stand and stare, to listen to the twittering of nestlings, the hum of the early foraging bees, and the first sound of the cuckoo from the coppice across the fields. Spring is the loveliest time of year at Fairacre, when everything is young and green and alive with hope. Soon the house martins would be back, and the swifts screaming round and round the village as they selected nesting places. Then the swallows would arrive, seeking out their old familiar haunts, Mr. Roberts' barn rafters, the post office porch, the loft above the vicar's stables, in which to build their nests. Someone had brought me a bunch of primroses as an end-of-term present. Holding the fragrant nosegay carefully, I made my way through the school lobby toward my home across the playground, full of anticipation at the happiness ahead. The door scraper clanged, the door opened, and Mrs. Pringle, her mouth set grimly, confronted me. "Sorry I'm a few minutes late," she began, "but I'm in trouble." In Fairacre, this expression is commonly used to describe pregnancy, but in view of Mrs. Pringle's age, I rightly assumed that she used the term more generally. "What's wrong?" "It's our Minnie," said Mrs. Pringle. "Up my place, in a fair taking she is. Can't do nothing with her. I've left her crying her eyes out." "Oh dear," I said weakly, my heart sinking. Could Amy have heard aright? I smelt my sweet primroses to give me comfort. "Come to the house and sit down," I said. Mrs. Pringle raised a hand and shook her head. "No, I've come to work, and work I will." "Well, at least sit on the bench while you tell me." A rough plank bench in the playground, made by Mr. Willett, acts as seat, vaulting horse, balancing frame, and various other things, and on this we now rested. Mrs. Pringle with her black oilcloth bag on her lap, and the primroses on mine. In the hedge dividing the playground from the lane, a blackbird scolded as Tibby, my cat, emerged from the schoolhouse to see why I was taking so long to get into the kitchen to provide her meal. "That man," said Mrs. Pringle, "has up and left our Minnie. What's more, he's left his kids and hers and that one of theirs to look after, while he gallivants with that woman who's no better than she should be." "Perhaps he'll come back," I suggested. "Not him. He's gone for good. And you know who he's with?" "No," I said, expecting to be struck by lightning for downright lying. "You'll never guess. That Mrs. Fowler from Tyler's Row." I gave a creditable gasp of surprise. "That scheming hussy," said Mrs. Pringle wrathfully. A wave of scarlet color swept up her neck and into her cheeks, which were a-wobble with indignation. "It's my belief she knew he had an insurance policy coming out this month, after his money, you see. Well, it wouldn't have been his looks, would it?" I was obliged to agree, but remembered Amy's remark about the plain girls and the young Adonises at Cambridge. Who could tell? "But top and bottom of it all is, how's Minnie to live? Oh, I expect she'll get the Social Security and family allowance and all that, but she'll need a bit of work as well, I reckons, if she's to keep that house on at Springbourne." "Won't he provide some money?" "That'll be the day," said Mrs. Pringle sardonically, "unless Min takes him to court, and who's got the time and money to bother with all that?" Mrs. Pringle's view of British justice was much the same as her views on my housekeeping, it seemed, leaving much to be desired. "If she really needs work," I said reluctantly, "I could give her half a day here, cleaning silver and windows and things." Mrs. Pringle's countenance betrayed many conflicting emotions. Weren't her own ministrations on my behalf enough, then? And what sort of a hash would Minnie make of any job offered her? And finally, it was a noble gesture to offer her work anyway. Luckily, the last emotion held sway. "That's a very kind thought, Miss Reed, very kind indeed." She struggled to her feet, and we stood facing each other. Tibby began to weave between our legs, reminding us of her hunger. "But let's hope it won't come to that," she said. I hoped so too, already regretting my offer. Mrs. Pringle turned toward the lobby door. "I'll let you know what happens," she said, "but I'll get on with a bit of scrubbing now. Takes your mind off things, a bit of scrubbing does." She stumped off, black bag swinging, while Tibby and I made our way home. Chapter 3. Could it be Arthur Coggs? The policeman from Caxley, who had called upon the Coggses' household, was making inquiries, we learnt, about the theft of lead in the neighborhood. Scarcely a week went by, but the Caxley Chronicle reported the stripping of lead from local roofs around the Caxley area. Many a beautiful lead figure, too, which had graced a Caxley garden for generations, was spirited away under cover of darkness. Lead water tanks and cisterns, lead guttering, lead piping, all fell victim to a cunning band of thieves who knew just where to collect this valuable metal. It so happened that the Morns had an ancient summer house with a lead roof in their garden. Their house had been built in the reign of Queen Anne, and the octagonal summer house, according to Mr. Willett, who considered it unsafe and unnecessarily ornate, was erected not long afterwards, although it was more likely the conceit of some Victorian architect. It was hidden from the house by a shrubbery, and nothing could have been easier for thieves than to slip through the hedge from the fields adjoining the garden and do their work in privacy. The lead was not missed until a thundery shower sent cascades of water through the now unprotected roof into the little room below. A wicker chair and its cushions were drenched. A watercolor scene executed by Mrs. Maughan in her youth became more water than color overnight, and a rug which Mr. Maughan had brought back from Egypt on one of his bird-watching trips, and which he much prized, was quite ruined. Added to all this was the truly dreadful smell composed of wet timber and the decaying bodies of innumerable insects, mice, shrews, and so on, washed from their resting places by the onrush of rain. Fairacre was shocked at the news. It was one thing to read about lead being stolen from villages a comfortable distance from their own in the pages of the respected Caxley Chronicle. It was quite another to find that someone had actually been at work in Fairacre itself. What would happen next? Mr. Willett voiced the fears of his neighbors as he returned from choir practice one Friday night. "Who's to stop them blighters pinching the new lead off the church roof? It cost a mint of money to put on. It'd make a fine haul for some of these robbers." A violent storm some years earlier had damaged St. Patrick's sorely. Only by dint of outstanding efforts on the part of the villagers and never-to-be-forgotten generosity from American friends of Fairacre had the necessary repairs been made possible. The sheets of lead then fixed upon much of the roof had formed one of the costliest items in the bill. No wonder Fairacre folk feared for its safety now that marauders had visited their village. "They wouldn't dare to take the Lord's property," announced Mrs. Pringle. "I don't think they care much whose property it is," observed Mr. Lamb from the post office. "It's just how easy they can turn it into hard cash." "My sister in Caxley," replied Mrs. Pringle, still seeking the limelight, "told me the most shocking thing happened all up the road next to hers." "What?" asked Mr. Willett. The party had reached the post office by now and stopped to continue the conversation before Mr. Lamb left them. Twilight was beginning to fall. The air was still and scented with the flowers in cottage gardens. Mrs. Pringle looked up and down the road before replying. Her voice was low and conspiratorial. Mr. Willett and Mr. Lamb bent their heads to hear the disclosure. "Well, these lead thieves come out one night and went along all the outside lavatories and cut out every bit of piping from the cistern to the pan." "No." "They did, as true as I'm standing here." "What, every house?" Mrs. Pringle shifted her chins uncomfortably upon the neck of her cardigan. "Not quite all. Mr. Jarvis, him what was once usher at the court, happened to be in his when they reached it, so they cleared off pretty smartly." "Did they catch him?" "Not one of 'em," pronounced Mrs. Pringle. "Still at large they are, quite likely the very same as took Mr. Mohn's lead off the summer house." "Could be," agreed Mr. Lamb, making towards his house now that the story was done. "Though I heard as Arthur Coggs might be mixed up with this little lot." Now," said Mr. Willett, holding up a hand in a magisterial gesture. "No hearsay. It's not right to go accusing people. Us don't know nothing about Arthur being connected with lead stealing." "He's connected with plenty that's downright dishonest," rejoined Mr. Lamb with spirit. "Damn it all, man, he's done time. He's a poacher. He's been had up time and time again for stealing. And he ought to be had up for a lot of other things, to my mind, wife-beating for one, and dodging the column for another. Why, that chap hasn't done a day's work for weeks, and all us old fools keeps him by giving him the dole and family allowances. Makes my blood boil." "We knows all that," agreed Mr. Willett, taking a swipe at a passing bat with a rolled-up copy of Handel's Messiah. "But you can't just pin everything that's crooked on Arthur Coggs." "Why not?" asked Mrs. Pringle belligerently. "More times than not, you'd be right." And on this note, the friends parted. Human nature being what it is, there were far more people in Fairacre who shared Mrs. Pringle's view than Mr. Willett's. Arthur Coggs was the black sheep of the village, and his wife greatly pitied. He was supposed to be a laborer, although his neighbors stated roundly that labor was the last thing Arthur looked for. He occasionally found a job on a building site carrying a hod or wheeling a barrow slowly from one place to the next, but he rarely stayed long. Either he became tired of the work, or more often his employer grew tired of paying him to do nothing. The greater part of his money went on beer, and he was a regular customer at the Beetle and Wedge in Fairacre. He and his family had once occupied a tumble-down cottage, one of 4 in Tyler's Row, now made into one long, attractive house occupied by a retired schoolmaster from Caxley and his wife. The Coggs family had been rehoused in a council house which was fast becoming as dilapidated as their last abode. Mrs. Coggs, with a large family to cope with and very little money with which to do it, struggled to tidy the house and garden, but never succeeded. Over the years, she had grown thinner and grayer. Her highest hopes were that Arthur would stay sober and that he would provide more housekeeping money. So far, her hopes had not been realized. Now and again, Arthur would appear to have money in his pocket, and this she felt certain was the result of some dishonest dealings. Arthur had appeared in the court at Caxley on many occasions, and his list of previous convictions handed up from the bench to study included such offenses as theft, receiving goods knowing them to have been stolen, shoplifting, burglary, and housebreaking. Mrs. Coggs knew better than to question Arthur about any unusual affluence. A black eye or painful bruises elsewhere would have been the outcome. But experience had given her some cunning, and she had sometimes been able to abstract a pound note or some change from his pocket when he was fuddled with drink. Pity for Arthur's wife had prompted several people in Fairacre to employ her dissolute husband over the years. Mr. Roberts, the local farmer, had taken him on as a farmhand, only to find that eggs vanished, 1 or 2 hens disappeared, as well as sacks of potatoes and corn. The other men complained that they were doing Arthur's work as well as their own, and they were right. Mr. Roberts dispensed with Arthur's services. Mr. Lamb had tried to employ him as a jobbing gardener, but again found that vegetables were being taken, and the jobs set him were sketchily done, and the local builder's patience snapped when he caught Arthur red-handed walking home with a pocketful of his tools. The plumber at Springbourne, whose soft heart had been touched by the sight of Mrs. Coggs and her 4 children all in tears one morning as he passed through Fairacre, was moved to take on Arthur for a week's trial. By Wednesday, he discovered that a considerable amount of copper piping had vanished, and Arthur was sacked once more. Virtually, he was unemployable, and soon realized that he was far better off collecting his Social Security allowance and other monies dispersed by a benevolent government, and indulging his chronic laziness at the same time. He was known to be in tow with some equally feckless and dishonest men in Caxley, and in fact Arthur frequently acted as lookout man when the more daring of the gang were breaking in. His wages for this kind of work were in proportion to the loot obtained, but always far less than the share each burglar received. "You didn't take much risk, chum," they told him. "Piece of cake being lookout, you can reckon yourself lucky to get this bit." And Arthur agreed. As long as it helped to keep him in beer, there was no point in arguing. For a while, immediately after the discovery of the loss of Mr. Maughan's roofing lead, Fairacre folk were extra careful about making their homes secure. People actually shut their front doors on sunny days instead of leaving them hospitably open for neighbors to enter. They began to hunt for door keys, long disused, and some very funny places they were found in after the passage of time. Mr. Willett, after exhaustive searching, admitted that he found his front door key at the bottom of a biscuit tin full of nuts, bolts, screws, hinges, padlocks, latches, tacks, brass rings, and other useful impedimenta vital to a handyman. His neighbor found his on top of the cistern in the outside lavatory. The 2 Mrs. Waters, Margaret and Mary, who had a horror of burglars but so far relied on a stout bolt on both back and front doors, now scoured their small cottage in vain for the keys they had once owned. It was Margaret who eventually remembered at 3 o'clock one morning that they had hidden them under the 4th stone which bordered their brick path, when they were going away for a brief holiday some years later. At first light she crept out and unearthed them red with rust. She remained in a heady state of triumph all day. Mr. Lamb, it seemed, was the only householder in Fairacre who locked up and bolted and barred his premises methodically every night. But then, as people pointed out, as custodian of the Queen's mail, he'd have to see things were done properly, or he'd soon get the boot. No one gave him credit for his pains, and to be honest, Mr. Lamb was sensible enough not to expect any. But at least he was spared the searching for keys, for his own hung, each on its hook and carefully labeled, ready for its nightly work. For a time, even the children caught the fever and became aware that it was necessary to be alert to dishonesty. One Caxley market day, Linda Moffat and Eileen Burton arrived each with a door key on a string around their necks. "My mom's gone on the bus to buy some material for summer frocks," said Linda, "and she may not be back when I get home." "And mine's gone to buy some plants," announced Eileen. "Ours never come to nothing." "If they never come to nothing," I said severely, "then they must have come to something. Say what you mean." The child looked bewildered. "I did, miss. Our seeds never come—" "Your seeds did not come up," I said with emphasis. "That's what I said." "You did not say that," I began, and was about to embark for 1,000th time on an elementary grammar lesson when Mr. Willett intervened. He had been listening to the exchange. "Your mum's seed never come up," he said forcefully, "because she uses that plaguey compost muck out of a bag. She wants to mix her own, tell her, with a nice bit of soft earth and dung and sprinkle of sharp sand. Tell her they'll never come to nothing on that boughten stuff." Never come to nothing. I gave up and turned to the marking of the register. And we'll get past the register and the grammar next time.